Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everybody. Ryan here with a very special episode of The Tone Engineer. Part one of many, in fact, as this series will cover the recording process and the tone engineering of Illatria, Calamitous Constructs, my latest EP release, going through the sounds of not only the drum kits, but the stringed instruments, vocals, and the overall mixing and mastering process. Today we're going to be kicking it off with the foundation of any heavy metal mix, which is, of course, the drum kit. As I cautioned in a previous video, the tips and tricks and processes that inevitably will be presented in this series are not the rule of law. They're not the only way to go about this. And in fact, there are some things, speaking for myself, there's some things that you probably shouldn't do it the way that I'm showing you, but I am showing options. And most importantly, the things that we performed, the types of processes we went through to obtain the sound were in service of the sound. They're in service of the songs, and ultimately they're a means to an end. There's no doubt going to be some things that I've absorbed from masters of this musical arena that you might recognize. There's going to be things that some of you, maybe with more experience, will see and go, why the hell would you do it that way? Or that's an odd looking signal chain, why are you using that plugin? But nonetheless, this is the way that we went about it, and I thought for those of you, especially who are just kind of getting off the ground with music recording and maybe a higher level of production than you've done in the past, this could be, a good reference point to see things that you could implement, things that you might want to stay away from, and ultimately what we did to achieve the sound that we made. So with that, let's get cracking with the instrument that I am absolutely hopeless on by myself outside of a MIDI keyboard, the drum kit. And for this, I have the honor, nay privilege, to once again bring on my virtual bandmate and interwebs friend, Paris.
Welcome everybody, Paris here on behalf of Plague Scythe Studios. As a fan of Ryan's channel, I've done my best to structure this segment in a way that would feel familiar to fans of Plague Scythe Studios. There will be no skits, visual gags, or jokes. So before I begin, I might want to disclose that despite my coherence and sobriety, I am a drummer. Without sound treatment, the acoustics in this room are comparable to Andy Sneap's cousin's next-door neighbor's broom closet. Frequencies naturally build in the sub-500 Hz range, especially in these corners. You can make dramatic differences with simple solutions, but like a post-coital cigarette to the tune of a cryptic weather forecast, some reflection is inevitable. Here's what I use for Illatria. Stack of towels here, rolled up comforters here, and the cheapest eBay foam I could find here and here. My room mic was positioned here in this hallway. There's some good information on YouTube about more expensive studio-grade foam versus what we would typically have sitting around the house. I'll have Ryan link a good video on the subject. In short, if you're in a room like this, don't waste your money on this. Here's all the mics I used on the project. If there's any interest on drum mic selection on a budget, feel free to put a request down in below. The drum set used was this DW Exotic Series birch kit. Heads are coated all around on the batter side for a dry, muted sound without any tricky overtones. Rather than moon gel, I use bits of packing tape here on my toms. With a Remo Power Stroke head like this, there's actually a dampening pad pressed into the head between layers, indicated by the pinstripe. The kick drum also had a Remo Flam Slam pad installed prior to tracking here. Cymbals are bright bronze Sabian Paragon cymbals. I like bright cymbals, as they contrast well with the low end that builds across these drums. I use a 13-inch hi-hat, an 8-inch splash, 18-inch china, 22-inch ride, 16 and 18-inch crashes. Hardware is 9000 series all round, with the double kick pedal running plastic beaters. This is a DW Edge snare drum, which fuses metal alloy, DW doesn't say which, with a 10-ply maple shell. The internet says they weigh somewhere between 20 and 22 pounds. I can believe it. DW recommends you tune this high for R&B and low for rock and studio recording. I tune high because the rest of the songs on the Illatria EP are actually DeBarge covers.
Your drummer's performance needs to feed two sources, one being your drummer's headphone mix, and the other, of course, being your recording interfaces. There's a couple of different ways to go about this. I'll show you what I do. Now,
for Focusrite users, we have mix control, where we can manipulate the outputs here and here like a software mixer. I use a more simplistic setup that gives me greater flexibility, this 2-post snake. These are twin sends of 32 channels, one set of 32 going to my interface, and the other set going to this old analog mixer. Since this mixer is on the other side of the room, I run an RCA cable to an ART headphone preamp behind me. For personal monitoring, I use a pair of Shure SE425s. Quick thoughts on these: incredibly uncomfortable, but with clear, ample separation thanks to the twin drivers. These bigger Vic Firths sound abysmal, and the right channel is out completely, but they do provide great natural isolation. I put these on over my in-ears, which keeps the earbuds from falling out while I play. I can also run the volume on my in-ears lower this way, as I'm not competing for volume with the live kit. Back to my interfaces. These are running into my computer via Firewire. The DAW I'm using is Cubase 5. You may notice my project file is already bust and running some plugins. I can explain what all this stuff is doing in another video if you like, but the short version is this is adding some separation with a little EQ and transient shaping. I use parallel compression to add some additional force to the kick and snare. Here's an example. Once all the tracks are rendered, I'll dump them onto a flash drive in a folder labeled Unprocessed. There are 2 more stops before mixing, with the files as they are in the DAW being iteration 1. The next 2 iterations ahead of mixing happen in my mixing room, so let's go. Everything's already booted up in here, so let's plug this in. Put the files on the computer, and then we're going to import everything into Drumatom. Drumatom is a gating software that eliminates bleed without cutting transients short. For an example, you have your snare mic, but it's picking up the hi-hat. This isn't good because the more you work with your snare, the more you're working with the hi-hat's bleed. Drumatom can eliminate the hi-hat, but it requires adjustment, otherwise you'll be filtering out some of the signal you want in your close mics. I only have the standalone version, so I can't keep it open the entire time in a project file to infinitely adjust. It's also a resource hog, so I wouldn't use it as a VST anyway. If you'd like a video on Drumatom, again, hit me up. The TLDR is, don't use it on toms. Drumatom renders out the gated files with processed added to the title by default, so I rename everything as gated in a separate folder for my unprocessed tracks. The next step is auto-align, a phase correction software. Ryan has covered phase in another video on his channel, so you probably already know where this is going. Since we have 14 different tracks, we have to get all of them in phase, with one exception depending on who you ask. Sound Radix's auto-align functions similar to a plugin, but just a little more complicated. To heavily paraphrase, you run an instance of auto-align on every track, using one track, usually an overhead mic, as a track that all other tracks lock into. You go through each track and run auto-align, which shifts samples to get the receiving track in phase with the sending track. There are quite a few videos on how this works, and they don't all agree with each other, but I'll condense everything into a before and after sound sample. Now that we're in the mixing phase, it's time for us to take our gated and phased tracks into a fresh project file and start mixing with them proper. The only processing that I've done up to this point is that initial EQ and transient shaping. What comes next is actual mixing. It's more or less dependent on what the guitars are doing, what the bass is doing, what the vocals are doing. But when we're working remotely like this, I try to scope things in such a way that I offer as much as possible to be reduced or taken away. Now, for Illatria, I've used Waves CLA plugins in their Abbey Roads console. I've had good experiences using their plugins so far and highly recommend them when they go on sale. This is also an iterative process. I'll do a snapshot mix and let my ears cool down every few hours or so. The next day, I'll listen to the snapshot and go back in, adjusting things as necessary. We're getting a bit long into it by now, so I'll wrap this up with some general live drum mixing advice. Think of your overheads as a sonic blanket over the kit. You want your close mics to punch through that blanket, so concentrate on attack. The air will come from your overheads, so don't sculpt those too much. You're not only fixing the cymbals when you adjust the overheads. Don't get aggressive with compression on your overheads or close mics, but save that for the room mic. If you want a big, huge sound out of the drum set, slam that room mic with compression. Generally speaking, you want to adjust all your close mics in the ballpark of 250 to 550 Hz, reducing and sculpting for clarity. I could do more stuff on mixing drums or other stuff like quantizing and using samples if y'all want me to, but we're at 7 pages of the script already, so let's get into our... Fuck. Well, I'll leave it off there. I believe I've covered every phase of drum production as I've done for Illatria. Any specific questions about anything that I've covered or didn't cover, leave the subscribe in the comments. Be sure to check out Raycon Shadow VPN, Folate Algo Daddy, help Ryan get his YouTube McMansion. I'll see you guys later. Bye. Well, I'll leave it off there.
Thank you, Paris, once again for that very straightforward, not comedic at all segment. This is a man that not only understands the assignment of heavy metal drumming, but the assignment of a Plague Scythe Studios video. Remember, no jokes, no levity. We're always super ethereal. Onto my contributions to the drum sounds then. This segment should probably be called minimizing my contributions to the drum sound, because as the principal mixer for this album, I have a bit of a conflict of interest, because not only am I the mixer, I'm the guitarist, the bass guitarist, and the vocals. So I have to balance all those things on top of something that somebody else has recorded. So obviously my ears are probably going to be more tuned to my performances, and being a guitar player for most of my life, especially the guitar sound. So there's a good chance that by nature I might want to overemphasize the guitars especially, and then trying to counter that I might accidentally overemphasize the drum sound to try to underemphasize the overemphasized guitars, if that makes sense. So this entire process is very much trying to strike that fine balance of making sure his dynamics and his performance is captured, that the natural sound of the kit isn't completely destroyed. He has a lovely drum kit. I don't want to make this thing sound like a 2000s sample that you got off of 7string.org. I want to make sure this still sounds like the real deal. Pun unintended, actually. So what you'll hear for all of these samples is just the raw signal chain as it pertains to the drums only. However, whenever I'm starting off on any mix project, I always mix into plugins. This was very much a trick that, I've picked up from masters such as Nolly, who generally have some sort of rudimentary signal chain built up right off the bat to kind of simulate what the real signal chain might be. So in this instance, for every instrument, I'm going to have some EQ, specifically some saturation in an EQ circuit, with a little bit of boost in specific frequency ranges, and a good old-fashioned Waves SSL compressor. And I definitely didn't have these settings at first, right, when I first began this project and was starting to feed instrument buses into this master instrument bus, but they were pretty close, and this definitely informed the way that I mixed those instruments individually, because you get a different effect if you do this step at the very end, because you might have overdone a compressor on one instrument, not realizing that you're going to kind of, compress and limit the entire signal chain at the end. So I'm going to turn these off, which namely includes a 50 Hertz high pass and a shitload of gain reduction. That way I wouldn't have to mess with the individual volume faders too much on all the instruments feeding into that. So you'll hear at the end the contributions of this once I turn them back on, but for demonstration purposes, so you can hear exactly what each one of the plugins and moves are doing to all the individual drum files, I'll have these off at first. Likewise, in the master bus, which kind of serves as my overall master, mixing and master bus in this case, which I'll get into at a later video, I'm just going to have a limiter and brick wall limiter turned on that are going to be doing basically nothing. This is just to make sure that nothing is clipping on the output signal chain. These would be working harder if I had the rest of the signal chain there, but as it stands, they're not really going to be doing anything in this video. So let's start off by taking a look at the files that Paris provided me after his workflow of EQ tweaks and the bit of isolation post-processing that he performed. We have 3 separate kick drum sounds, a dynamic microphone, condenser microphone, and a sample that he created. We have a similar setup for the snare drum, a top microphone, bottom microphone, and another sample that he created. The toms, he actually made a sub mix and just sent me basically a stereo toms file, so I didn't have to worry about the panning or, trying to make sure they're volume equalized. He kind of did that work for me, which, as, again, someone who does not play drums and wants to make sure that they still have their own contributions to the character of that kit, there's yet another thing that I like that he did where I wasn't able to mess that up, and he got that drum spread the way that he wanted it, which is exactly what I like. Similarly, I was provided a mix for the cymbals, like the hi-hat, the ride, the crash cymbals, and if this were coming from someone less experienced, this would have been a point of concern, but not so here, as all the volumes and dynamic ranges were close enough that I didn't need to request any, differences in the mix. So that saved me a ton of time, much appreciated there. And then we have a room microphone and overhead microphone for the snare and kick, again isolated using the techniques that Paris showed you earlier with some of the, more raw overhead signals coming from that cymbal mix. Now, you can take all this stuff and just throw it into one drum bus or throw it in your master instrument bus. But to quote South Park for yet another time in this episode, you're going to have a bad time because there's not a whole lot of overlap in the frequency response of all of these different percussion instruments. There is some, and where there is, it's kind of problematic, especially with the high end of the snare and where the cymbals are. But you can't apply equal treatment to everything, right? You can't just throw it all into one master track and expect to have good results, because every time the kick drum hits, it's going to probably duck the entire output if you have just a master compressor on everything, and then it's going to have some really weird behavior when you have high frequency stuff that's probably going to end up, piercing your ears. So long story short, you really need to have separate buses for every one of these files if you're expecting this to mix into a song the ways that you're kind of used to hearing on contemporary metal tracks. Now, what I tend to start with is the kick drum, as that is the foundation of a lot of heavy metal passages. With the snare, I'm leaning more heavily on the snare on a lot of these songs than I think other bands would be for these kind of similar groove-based music. But the kick drum you absolutely have to nail. So going through these, evaluating each of the files separately, that helped determine what frequency response I wanted to maintain out of each of the tracks and which ones I wanted to almost eliminate entirely. Like Paris said in his segment, he gave me a lot of information, more information that's necessary for, a sub mix like this, but that's exactly what I wanted, because I want to be able to, tailor the sound to fit the rest of the recordings, but not fundamentally change the sound of the kit. I wasn't going for the Injustice for All typewriter kick sound, but I definitely had to gut some of the content. So with the dynamic microphone kick, we're looking at only broadband EQ changes with a fairly aggressive low pass, a little bit of a high pass, just to get some of the junk out of there. And you're going to notice for a lot of these drums, I am nuking the EQ to below negative 12 decibels a lot of the time, because again, I was provided a lot of content, and for this one, you could absolutely raise the entire output of this EQ and just compensate with the gain, but it's just the way this kind of turned out, and I'm not going to change it now because it doesn't really matter. The overall output on all three of these are exactly the same at negative 6.59 decibels. For the next track, I actually tried to play with a reverb that I ended up taking off. But for this one, we're just looking at a high pass, a little bit higher on the condenser microphone. I found a woofy frequency I didn't like around 500 hertz. So it was kind of about like a, I don't know, this honky, woody thing that I didn't like. So I got rid of that and took out a little bit of junk in the 120 hertz region. But otherwise, what I was trying to do was preserve the thud, but get some of the click in the high end, again, without going full-blown typewriter. On both of this track and the aforementioned track, I did play with the envelope shaper a little bit, just to get a little bit more transient out of it. Not that it was lacking any, but by the time I started adding compression and things after the fact, I found that it wasn't getting quite the punch that it had originally, so I was just trying to make up for it there with some increased attack and decreased release. Same story with the sample on the envelope shaper, and just basically filling in the frequency responses that I felt were just slightly lacking on the condenser and dynamic microphone. If you took this sample out, the kick would still very much sound like the kick, but this was just another reinforcement that I ended up liking. Now, all these were summed into the master kick bus here, and this is where things start to get a little bit more aggressive. First of all, is just like the last tracks, the channel strips coming before all of my inserts here, and you're going to notice some wacky EQ moves. Just like with the last tracks, I very much could have moved these EQs up a little bit in the gain range and just compensated for it with master gain, but that's not the workflow that I ended up with. For the signal chain in the inserts, we have something that's quite a bit more complex. So first off, we have a Pultec EQ clone from Ignite Amps that I have this boost and attenuation set at the exact same level for the low frequency, which is something that Pultec doesn't recommend you do, but it was an old studio trick just to kind of highlight a couple different sub frequencies, and it does so in a way that I wasn't able to replicate with just plain EQ no matter what I boosted or cut. So I said, what the hell, I'll try it out, and I really like the results actually. Next we have a single instance of TDR Nova just acting as a regular EQ, cutting around the 2000 hertz frequency range because just wanted something else. After all this EQ, after that we have the first pass of compression, the Red 3 compressor from Focusrite, and as you'll see, I go through multiple stages of compression for a lot of things where I kind of get a little bit of work out of both of them. I feel it does a better job. It sounds more natural when you chain them together for certain instruments than it does if you have one thing kind of flatlining the signal. So I'll have this as kind of my first stage with a little over a 3-to-1 ratio, and then after that we'll have a CLA 76 instance with not quite nearly as much attack. We're looking in the 2.0 and only a ratio of 4-to-1 here. So really, I'm just trying to catch the peaks that this one leaves, just for a little bit more consistency. And as you'll see when this plays, this needle, in terms of gain reduction, is doing a lot more work than this one. This is very much a typical compressor type, using VCA with, the Focusrite especially, and it's just something that is a staple for kick drum post-production. After that, I've got 2 stages of limiters to once again try to spread the workload across different dynamic range manipulation, and this is just to get more volume consistency. You're going to see both of these are doing, once again, just a little bit of gain reduction, nothing too crazy, as I'm not trying to make these things sound like machine guns, but when you're competing with 4 guitars and multi-track vocals and a tractor sounding bass, you sometimes have to go to extreme lengths to get those things to sound consistent. Finally, we end off with an instance of a multi-band compressor, the C4 stereo, and really just trying to keep the low end and extreme high end in check. That way the hardest hitting kicks and the softest hitting kicks don't have a entirely different amount of low end coming through, or high end for that matter, because that tends to be the most problematic frequency ranges, where, let's say on Plague Doctor, the introduction through the first couple of verses is oh, you love my snare impression. And then contrasted with the section going into the solo, where there's a lot of double kick stuff, those are not being played at the same intensity on purpose as the single kicks before it. So you want to kind of manage that amount of low end, especially high end, since there's kind of some, some clicky frequencies going on, to make sure that they don't sound totally alien. And that was very much dialed in by ear to make sure that those different types of playing still sounded consistent in terms of how much the kick drum is contributing to the overall mix, but still making it sound like you're playing those things differently. And that's a fine balance. And actually, finally, I end off this bus with a plain Jane gain VST plugin from Blue Cat Audio, because I absolutely nuked the gain coming into the master drum bus. So I was just using these to have plenty of headroom and make up for it elsewhere. As you'll see throughout a lot of this stuff, this is things that, once again, you can't do in the analog world because it would cause signal to noise ratio issues, but in the digital world you can get by and be a little bit more sloppy like I did. And because of my workflow, a lot of this stuff was iterative, and I would, pile this on over the course of weeks or months sometimes. So it was just nice to be able to pick up where you left off, just solve the problem you're having, and not worry about having to redo the entire signal chain to get there. The snare, the overall same kind of philosophy. So for this, I didn't really have to mess with the envelope shaper at any point that I recall, and it appears to be proven here with my signal chain. And then for the EQ, as you're going to see, I left a lot of the low end intact. I did implement a subtle high pass just to, once again, to get rid of some of the junk frequencies, but I was very keen on getting the right thwack out of each one of these tracks and kind of combining them to be the most reinforced, consistent, full frequency thing. You know, like the perfect snare sound to me probably doesn't exist in a real drum, but I want something that has like that high end crack of like a Deftones sounding snare, but the punch of, you know, the Injustice for All snare. I don't really know what that would look like or what size snare that is, but this one came really close and it fits the music perfectly. So summing all these three tracks together into the snare bus at different volumes, we have this one about 3.2 decibels above zero, this one about 3.7 decibels below, this one at 2.23 above. So the bottom snare was definitely undermixed the most in comparison to these tracks. We end up with yet another high count for our VST plugins in the insert, with a little bit crazier EQ moves here, again happening before the VST plugins. I was able to get all the EQ moves I needed there, so I didn't need another EQ plugin. Once again, going with the Focusrite Red 3 compressor, going into another instance of CLA 76, and I experimented with Flatline for some, you know, actual clipping, but I didn't like the results, so I kept that off. That's still in there. Transient shaper is a big one. This is something that I played with a lot throughout all of the percussion mixing and left it on for the snare. This is a soft tube product with just a little bit of clipping and saturation, and I liked the results of this better than Flatline, hence why I kept it. For the limiting, we just have one instance of the limiter. I felt like the rest of the clipping kind of took care of the dynamic range manipulation that I needed. This one set at a -3 threshold, and it does some work sometimes, you'll see. Unlike the kick drums, I did end up adding just a touch of room reverb, like 10% here, just to kind of glue all three of those snare tracks together and add a little bit back to what otherwise, you know, might sound like an unnatural decay because it was so isolated and might sound perfect. So that helped glue some things, hardly even noticeable. It doesn't sound like reverb, right? If you just isolate this track, you're not going to think, oh, that was recorded in, you know, like a 1980s kind of fashion. This is just, again, to act as glue. And to kind of control the effects of this and that gluing action, I do have TDR Nova acting more in its kind of typical dynamic EQ. So this isn't exactly multi-band compression, but it's pretty close. I use this on CDRM Children of the Stars a ton as well. And on the highest band, I do have a bit of threshold working here. So with a ratio of 2:1 at a -7.2 dB threshold, we're going to have some amount of gain reduction just to make sure that, once again, those most intense hits and the least intense hits don't crowd the cymbal frequency response range too much. Got a little bit of mid-range reinforcement happening in this band at 2200 hertz because it's just one of those frequencies that sounded really good on this snare, and I wanted to highlight it after the fact, after all of the compression, because as you'll probably notice, post-EQ, or I should say post-compression EQ, has quite a bit different and I think a more pronounced change, a more consistent change than pre-compression EQ, because that kind of determines what frequencies you're feeding the compressor and how it's acting. But after the compressor, then that kind of changes the entire voicing a little bit more aggressively. So up to this point, we got the kick bus, we've got a snare bus, both of these things running in parallel, and it sounds something like this. So for me, that accomplished the amount of airiness that I wanted on both of those instruments, and it doesn't sound fake to me. It just sounds like something that's coming from one instrument and works as a bass line to the percussion. I mean, you're going to be hearing this constantly. You want the kick and snare to sound pretty damn good. Onto the toms. This is something that I actually ended up running in parallel with Get Good Drums. Not out of pure necessity, but because the toms as they were given to me, I couldn't figure out how to get the transient the way I wanted it. So I ended up running Get Good Drums in parallel only for the toms, so you'll see some MIDI stuff going back here from where we were songwriting, and that's how I recorded my original demos, were with MIDI drums. But I've got some Pearl toms here. I have none of the VST instruments reverb dialed in, and I have the post-processing cranked all the way up. And really, this was just to get the very initial attack, the stick striking the head of the drum, because the way that I mixed his toms, it wasn't doing it for me, and it's not really a fault of the tracks as they were provided. This was a dark mix, and that was actually something that Paris mentioned to me, that going forward he would like a brighter mix and try that later. I really like the sound, the way that they turned out. But as you can hear, they kind of have more of the 90s Sepultura tom thing, which is great. I love that. But they don't have the transient click to kind of prime your ear to know, hey, a tom's just been hit the way that I wanted it to. So I ended up having these two ran in parallel. And it's so subtle that if I didn't tell you, you probably wouldn't even be able to hear Get Good Drums dialed in because it's not doing a whole lot. Again, just that one little roll there. On the sample track, I have an envelope shaper to highlight that initial hit. And then on the toms proper, since this is kind of its own mix bus, since he provided it for me, I kind of treated it as such. You're going to see some funky EQ moves just to get it to sit the way I needed it to when other things were playing. Again, a lot of these moves you're not going to be making until you hear it in context with other instruments. So, I was dialing this in with a lot of those heavy tom moments like in Supremacy or Under the Scythe to make sure you can still hear it with the electric guitars happening. And then for the signal chain, as it goes in the insert, I did add just a little bit of a noise suppressor. There was some high frequency stuff going on in the way that I mixed it where you couldn't hear it in the raw track, but it was starting to get more prevalent. So kind of cut that, act as an intelligent gate on the instance of TDR Nova. I have the third band acting as a dynamic EQ, just barely, just to kind of keep that mid-range in check, and mostly to make all three of the toms sound more consistent when you're going across the different ranges. Obviously, they have a different amount of mid-range content, so it's just to make them as a unit sound like toms and, kind of make them a little bit more even, a little bit of a low frequency bump there. Going forward, we have another instance of CLA 76 because it's just perfect for drums. We have another transient shaper. This time, this is a multi-band transient thing from Waves that kind of lets you emphasize different frequencies and how much they kind of spike when they are first present. And I found that was needed to kind of combat some of my compression, but still needed both in that order. Finally, another pass of limiting and another gain plugin just to make this a really easy volume change post insert, because the gain down here is only for the pre-strip stuff, and the gain output here is determined by automation, if you were wondering, which is why the read button is pressed. And once I did that, I didn't want to unpress it because I might have, had something that was already automated, like the level. Not really on the drums, I didn't really automate anything there, but as a rule, I just decided to put a gain output on a lot of this stuff to make my life easier. Cymbals, this one's a funny one. You want to talk about an excess of frequency content? Check out the high pass going on here at 250 hertz. By itself, especially in the context of the rest of the raw mix, sounded just fine. But as you'll probably hear once you start stacking compression on each other and all these other instruments come in, there's just a lot of junk that you don't have room for. So that had to go bye-bye. And I found a particularly offensive frequency at about 3000 hertz that I just tuned out just a little bit. before I put it in the rest of the plug-in chain. TDR Nova for this one, to my knowledge, you can tell I didn't even use any of these as a compressor or a dynamic EQ. This is just straight EQ, and it's really just in addition to what this EQ is doing in broader bands. The second pass of TDR Nova is really another pass of high pass and low pass that I wanted to implement after this first pass of EQ. Cymbals, especially if you get them in a mix like this, is so critical to carve out the useful frequencies because there's so many harmonics and high-end stuff that, it's not nearly as big of a deal as having too much low-end, but it can be very grating, and you want to make sure, especially in the context of vocals and, the stuff going on for 25 minutes, that it's not fatiguing. So finding that right balance is critical, and believe me, I did not get it the first try. So this was a lot of iterating. CLA 76 once again, because it's the same stale old joke for drum mixing. And I added a bit of a spatial enhancer. This is just the stock built-in Cubase stereo spread with just a little bit of delay on each microphone. Hardly noticeable at 130%, honestly. And it really didn't hurt anything without it. I just like to have the hi-hat just a little bit more on one side of the stereo spectrum, and I think it would just make it lean a bit more hard left if I remember right. But again, this was just as a result of not having the raw mix, and it worked just fine with this, and no need to go back and correct anything. There was nothing wrong. It's just I wanted a wider sounding drum kit. Finally, made all those changes glue together with just a little bit of drum smooth diffuse reverb from the Cubase Roomworks plugin. And this is just again to kind of bring in some mellow diffusion and kind of glue all the cymbals together, especially after making so many EQ moves that I did to kind of, bring out some of the bell overtones and have this washing effect that smooths it all out. At this point, the drum kit sounds like this. As far as the raw balance of levels goes, I definitely had to spend the most time on the cymbals just because I'm not a drummer and this stuff takes me longer. But the high frequencies was really, is critical to get this right on this project, and I like the way it turned out. Definitely spent a lot of time on the snares and kicks, don't get me wrong, but for me, just getting that right amount of jangly high end contrasted with the vocals was a very delicate balance. And again, these are settings you're not going to arrive on immediately. You're going to have to do this in iterations and balance everything out. Finally, we have the room microphone and the overhead microphone, which if you just heard that mix and thought, well, it's done, I mean, it very well could be. That may just work for you. However, I had these signals available, so why not use them? More crucially to me, this is one of those kind of imperfections by definition that you might not have access to, or might be pre-blended in a way that's not to your satisfaction on some sort of VST instrument. So being able to not only add back some of the imperfection that was taken away originally, but being able to dial up something that is undoubtedly the characteristic of the room this kit was recorded in, and some of the microphone bleed, that really helps. And it honestly acts as kind of a blanket. As you'll see, there is a ton of dynamic range manipulation happening on the room mic, and because rooms are, resonant boxes, there's going to be a lot of offending frequencies. So the goal for me here was to find something that just reinforced kind of the back plane, if you will, of the kick and the snare, to kind of have this flat, washy wall of sound at all times without being totally overbearing. And it's a fine balance, but in general, this is kind of what you might expect for a room microphone if you want to blend it in. Actually, looks like I didn't even end up using TDR Nova for the instance I have of the Pultec EQ. Looks like I just kept the same sort of trick I had on the kick drum, and with just, playing with some of the different frequency selectors. The Q2 here, this is simply a 2-band EQ on top of the 4-band I had here. Could have very well made this a 6-band and not even use this, but whatever. And this was just adding a bit more high end where I wanted it and taking out something around the 600 hertz region that I found was honky. As I mentioned earlier, a healthy amount of dynamic range manipulation with a compression ratio on the Red 3 model of 5:1, quite a low threshold and a decent amount of makeup gain. And then just to tie it all together to get this big washy thing going, I added a decent amount of reverb after the fact at 45%, mostly because I didn't want to add too much reverb anywhere else, like the kicks and the drums on their own, and this kind of gave me the opportunity to do that. The room microphone had a good amount of reverb on it, but it's actually not quite as lively as I wanted it to be after I compressed it. So this is just adding back some of that. And again, that reverb is going to get compressed more than once going forward, so that kind of adds back even more of what was taken away. The overhead microphone was a lot more simple, just a couple simple EQ moves with the TDR Nova, a more aggressive high pass and low pass than I originally just didn't do on the channel strip here for whatever reason, who knows, and then adding some stereo image because, again, them being overheads, just like the cymbals, I wanted a bit more spread. We're not talking a lot here though, like this width is barely above 0. So again, just to give a little bit more spread there. On their own, they sound like this. The rest of the drum kit sounds like this. And then all together they sound like this. As you can hear, you don't really miss it until it's gone. And I would say it probably sounds more sampley without it. It sounds more perfect, but with it, it sounds like a live kit. It sounds like something that was actually recorded, and it was, right? But without it, it does sound kind of dead, like you've played a guitar amplifier without a cabinet and just had some fake EQ stuff. Like there's no resonance, there's no, I don't know, there's just not a whole lot of life going on there. So as subtle as it is, kind of can't stand it without it. Now, if you really wanted to, you could sum all of that stuff up into one drum bus, and I've done that before. What I found out for this project was that it was more advantageous to actually just sum up the shells, the toms, the snare, the kick, and have its own bus, but keep the cymbals and the overhead and that kind of stuff going to the instrument on its own. The instrument bus, that is, on its own, which ultimately feeds the master bus. This workflow is going to change depending on the project and depending on how the mixes are delivered to you. Where I already had the cymbal mix, that helped a ton. If I didn't have that, I probably would have my own cymbal bus, right? But this kind of is its own cymbal bus. So what I did with the shells was add just a touch of noise reduction here. So this NS1 noise suppressor only kicks in at the very lowest levels, again, just to kind of chop off some stuff that would happen otherwise with, compression, raising your noise floor whenever it gets quiet. For that, I have just a very gentle high pass at 26 hertz, literally doing next to nothing there. I have another pass of multiband compression with C4 since I really wasn't doing that on basically any other instrument individually. The settings look extreme, but you'll see this isn't doing a whole lot unless there's like everything happening at the same time with the most intensity in terms of the attacks. And this is really just to make sure that when the drums are engaged and they're all happening at the same time, that they don't overwhelm the mix with a shitload of low end or a shitload of high end all at the same time. You know, it's okay if the snare cracks and you get a, you know, this threshold of high end. It's okay if the toms hit and you get this low end build up here. What's not okay is that they all do it at the same time, because the rest of the mix isn't really prepared for that. So this is just trying to mellow it out, make sure that from that particular thing, it's only going to be, you know, this much low end total. Then I hit another basic pass of SSL stereo compression. This one not working too hard, but just to kind of clip off some things that this one's not doing. And then a basic pass of VEQ4, mostly doing just kind of some shelving stuff on this one. And again, some more gentle high pass and low pass things, just like this EQ was doing in the beginning of the channel strip. The back-to-back limiters, yet another staple that, you know, these probably aren't doing a ton individually. They're both set at 0, so there shouldn't be a ton of clipping going on up until this point. And another TDR Nova, which isn't doing anything except for output gain. I probably had some EQ settings here at one point. I just got rid of them, so could have used the Blue Cat audio thing here and just never bothered to switch it. So now, with all that engaged, here is what the drums sound like without these inserts on the drum shells and with them. So that's where we're going to leave off on this mix for now, and that will do it for this Calamitous Constructs drum edition of Tone Engineer. I hope to see you back on this continued marathon of special tone engineers for Illatria, Calamitous Constructs. Any other questions or comments, please leave them down below. Hopefully you found something valuable or not valuable that you don't need to repeat, and that's totally cool as well. Otherwise, we'll see you down the road with some stringed stuff. Until then, bye.